What's up, everyone, and welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. I am the co host of the show, Kyle Anslone, and I'm joined by the co host, Will Porter. Will, how's it going today?
Good, Kyle. How you doing, man? How's everyone out there?
I'm doing well. I think we got a full show today. Of course, we had the Breonna Taylor grand jury results in that set off quite a storm, so we'll be weighing in on that. The Pentagon stealing a whole bunch of our money, and some updates on what's happening to Julian Assange in Yemen. So I think we got a real great show today. Make sure people are taking the time to share it. All the feedback me and Will have gotten on the show so far has been really positive. The download numbers look fantastic, and we're really excited. But share the show if you can. Facebook, Twitter, wherever you use social media. We're on both Facebook and Twitter. The Facebook page is just Conflicts of Interest, and Twitter is at con_interest. Then subscribe to the YouTube channel. And if you do that as you're listening to this show, you will likely have a chance to be the 100th subscribers. I think we have like 98 as of recording this. So things are looking good. And let's get into the show here, Will.
Right.
As I mentioned, the first thing we have up today is the grand jury indicts one of the three officers in the Breonna Taylor shooting, but nobody indicted for her death. The story here, written up by the Louisville Carrier Journal, says that 5 months after the shooting that killed her, and people demanding to arrest the cops who killed Breonna Taylor, nobody ends up getting arrested for that. They did indict one of the three officers, Brett, or I guess a former officer, Brett Hankinson, who I guess was fired for, or actually fired for prior to this, and then indicted for first degree wanton endangerment because a bunch of the bullets he fired just tore through the neighbor's apartment. So, cop gets scared, shoots his gun off like a lunatic, and actually gets somebody held responsible. But as far as it goes for, Miss Taylor, no justice for her death. So, Will, I guess we should maybe get into some of the details here. And break this down a little bit, because I am seeing a lot of like the pro Blue Lives Matter people saying that, well, she wasn't in bed, the cops knocked on the door, the boyfriend fired first, and so of course you're not going to indict anyone.
Yeah, right. I mean, with this verdict, it was interesting. We kind of had some preview, like we had some hint that it was going to come. The city was kind of they had sort of hinted at this, that there was going to be some verdict that people were not going to be too happy about, because I think they even declared a national emergency and stuff ahead of the announcement. But Wednesday, yeah, we finally got this announcement where, indeed, as you said, we did not get any charges related to her actual death, Breonna Taylor's actual death, just this wanton endangerment thing. And on the face of that, it kind of does sound outrageous. It's like they're saying, like, wow, like firing your gun like that was really dangerous. You could have gotten somebody killed, even, like theoretically as a hypothesis, when they actually did shoot somebody, or they did kill somebody shooting like that, so wantonly and, indiscriminately, basically. However, this jury found that Taylor's death was justified because her boyfriend opened fire at the officers first. And that is something we had known previously, that her boyfriend had shot at the officers. But like the more controversial part of all this, of this grand jury verdict, I don't know, there was a more controversial aspect. For a long time, we had understood that these cops were not in uniform; they were in plain clothes, and that they were serving a no-knock search warrant, where they can just basically bust down someone's door into their house. But now, with this verdict, the Kentucky Attorney General is saying that actually this was not a no-knock raid. And he's claiming that one of the witnesses there that heard the cops identify themselves and they knocked or whatever before they tried to break in, which happens to contradict like 10 other witnesses that had said, they did not announce themselves, as well as Breonna Taylor's family and her lawyers and stuff. They all maintain that, no, there was no announcement. But because of that testimony and that witness, apparently the grand jury decided that the cops were justified in shooting into Taylor's apartment, and they have no liability for her death, because, again, the cops apparently announced themselves. But they are saying that the one officer does have liability for endangering the other people by firing into their apartments, or near their apartments, sort of like, blindly or indiscriminately. So it does seem like this is all the punishment we're going to see for these three cops. It was just the one, too. The other two completely got off. They were all fired, but this Brett Hankinson guy is going to be the only one to face any charges, I think. And I don't think wanton endangerment is all that as severe of a charge. Certainly nothing like he would have seen it for like a homicide-related kind of indictment.
So I guess one thing, from my understanding, there's still an ongoing FBI investigation. And, one of the things we have here on the video feed is who killed Breonna Taylor, because the Kentucky police came up with, we can't tell. They said she was shot 6 times, but only one of those shots was fatal. So that's pretty crazy, too. I mean, this lady essentially ends up bullet ridden. But they said it was the officer Cosgrove that actually, fired the lethal shot. That according to the FBI analysis. And so, with the FBI actually doing that analysis, I thought maybe that the FBI would have something to say at the end of this. So I guess I'm not completely pessimistic that this is, the end of potential consequences for these officers, our former officers. Um, so,
If I could, do you mind if I cut in real quick right
yeah,
there?
go ahead.
I could be wrong. You could maybe correct me on this if I am mistaken. I thought the FBI was looking into specifically like a civil rights case, that whether there's any civil rights violations. And it seemed to me that if they're finding that her actual killing was justified, that like it seems that there would not be civil rights implications of that. But I might be mistaken. Maybe I misconstrued what the FBI is actually looking into there.
Oh, I mean, I could be wrong, but from my understanding was the FBI was still, I guess, looking at charges, and that it was not necessarily dependent on what this investigation came up with. And so maybe
Okay.
they won't be as serious or something like that. I guess just to get to one or two more details of the actual shooting itself before we maybe talk a little bit about no knock grades or stuff like that, um, is where Brionna died and was killed and how all that worked. And so initially they, the narrative was she was shot sleeping in bed, which seems actually not to be true, that she at least was awake and potentially had gotten dressed before she was shot, and that she was shot and killed in the hallway and not in bed. So does that seem right, Will, that she wasn't killed in bed?
Yeah, as far as I understand, that is not the case. That she was not shot in bed. That is something that people had been saying for a long time. There's a couple like similar claims like this that floated around a lot that ended up not being true. But yeah, as far as I understand, she was shot in the hallway. I'm not totally sure what hallway they're referring to. Whether they mean like the hallway within her actual dwelling. That's what I understand, inside her actual apartment building or apartment like dwelling, rather than the hallway of like the building itself. Like outside of her actual home.
Right. So then I was also just trying to get in my head here. The no knock grade was something that was the official narrative. Now the police say they have one witness who says they did hear the police announce, and I guess the police themselves are saying that they decided to announce themselves. But we have other witnesses who have said that the police didn't announce themselves. And I guess it seems like, at least in the grand jury hearing, so what the people of the grand jury actually got to hear was that the police announced themselves, and that this was probably, I'm guessing, weighed significantly in, them making their decisions, although, I don't know that for sure. So how do you have any a sense on like what the actual truth is? Because from my understanding, the police weren't wearing body cams either, and so all we really have is essentially the statements of these various witnesses.
Yeah, I mean, as far as like the balance of the witnesses, as far as I understand, there were far more witnesses saying that there was no announcement and no knock before they tried to bust down the door. I think there was just one witness who claims that yeah, they heard them announce themselves in some way. But the thing is about these types of raids they do, a lot of the time the cops will have they have to announce themselves, but they do it as they're smashing the door down. Basically, they say like police as they're hitting your smashing your door in, so that like I don't know. That doesn't really give much of a chance to like think about that or react. If you think that people are intruders, private criminals are breaking into your house, then like that might not do much to deter you shooting at them if you hear police or hear them shout something as the door comes down. So it's not totally clear to me. Like you said, there's no body cam footage, there's no body cams. So we don't have anything to really settle this question. But I do sort of get the impression, just based on things that I know about other raids and based on what some of these other witnesses said, that like, no, they did not really announce themselves like to a sufficient degree where her boyfriend inside would know, okay, this really is the police, and not just like, private criminals trying to come, rob me or do a home invasion or something.
Right. So I guess I'm pretty sure we talked about this either on foreign policy focus or conflicts of interest in the past, Will. And we had obviously come to the conclusion that the police murdered Breonna Taylor. And I was just, I still stick with, murder, and at least, the officer who put this together, and then Cosgrove, who actually fired the, fatal shot, should be charged with murder. Maybe there's a third officer who didn't fire his gun as recklessly towards Breonna Taylor, and somehow they could prove that, and willing to hear that case. But at least two of these three officers seem like they need to be charged with murder for me, Will. And that didn't change for me at all, hearing these new details and what the grand jury said. And I'm just curious with it seems, at least looking on Facebook, some people are changing their mind. A lot more of the thin blue line matter people are making the argument that the cops were justified here. I was wondering if your mind had changed on it at all.
No, not really. Again, like we're saying, we're only talking about one witness here that is saying that's contradicting the other 10 or so. I forget the exact number of witnesses that say there was not an announcement. But to me, that's like, I don't know, just hearing what one person says it, so all the other ones are completely negated. Like I'm pretty skeptical of that. And yeah, like I tend to think that these officers should have faced more, at least the ones who are directly responsible for the, actually shooting her. Or at least even shooting into her apartment or something. They probably should have faced, more consequences than what we see here.
Yep. So then, just looking at another thing for me was, I think a lot of people are focusing on whether the police knocked or not. I think another thing that really should come into question here is the time that the police went to this apartment, and if there was a need to go that late during the day. It just, right. Thinking of the situation that, the guy was armed. They had at least claimed that, Breonna Taylor's former boyfriend was involved in the drug world, and that's why they were looking for her. So, she was somebody who maybe was concerned about somebody coming to her house in the middle of the night and trying to harm her. And my guess is that if somebody's trying to murder somebody, they're not above saying that they're the police at the door. So, one of the reasons why police officers should really focus more on apprehending people in easier ways. Like if you really feel like you need, to arrest Miss Taylor and search her apartment, just wait till she leaves. Once she walks out the door, come put her in handcuffs and then walk inside. But that's obviously not the path they chose here. And it doesn't make sense why you would do this in the middle of the night unless, you just see yourself as like some special forces guy in Afghanistan kicking down the Taliban door and getting him while he's in his jammies or something like that. And this is the U.S. Will. We're not supposed to have our cops behaving like this, and it's pretty absurd. And unless cops start being held responsible, I don't think much will change. It's nice that I think the city of Lexington and the state of Kentucky have made some reforms as far as, higher up officers had to, apparently sign off on search warrants, and they're going to try not to do the no knock warrants or, raids during night if they don't have to. But at the same time, the cops will find different exceptions to be able to carry out the raids they want to carry out. You know what I mean? They'll find a way to paint whoever in court they want to as being the, Pablo Escobar, Kentucky, and them having to, come in the middle of the night to make sure they don't flush all the coke down the toilet. And so I guess I don't see it getting better until, they start holding cops more accountable, even with some of these reforms. And, taking up something like, Rand Paul's Breonna Taylor Act, I still think could be helpful too. Getting rid of no knock, raids as a country completely is something far different than just, trying to regulate it so it's a little bit harder for some average street cop to do.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Something definitely more strict and radical than what they're, this kind of like beating around the bush, this like, tinkering around the edges kind of reforms they're doing. People respond to incentives. You need to make there be something to incentivize the officers to not do things like this. And if there's no consequences, there's no repercussions, then they're gonna they never will have a reason to stop. It doesn't, that it won't change.
Right. So if we could just start holding cops accountable for shooting people, and different U.S. officials responsible for war crimes, maybe we can make some difference here, Will.
Yeah, like the law and everything. The law.
So the next one I have here, Will, is you wrote up over at RT, and this was, I guess, last night, Wednesday night. I'm sorry, we record this thing early in the morning, so sometimes it's hard to track days. 2 officers shot in Louisville amid protest over Breonna Taylor charges, 1 suspect in custody. So tell us, Will, what's going on in the response to the grand jury not indicting these officers?
Yeah. So I mean, as you might expect, like right after they announced this verdict, you had protesters taking to the streets within like an hour. Like even just like that afternoon, they had already started to like gather and mobilize and started planning, the protest. And by nighttime, as these things tend to happen, some protesters started tearing stuff up, lighting a few small fires, smashing some windows. It certainly was not anything like we've seen in other cities like Minneapolis or even Kenosha, but it did get fairly rowdy. But to the extent that it was contained, I think it probably had something to do with the preparations the city had taken before the announcement. Like I said, they declared like a national, or not a national, a local emergency, a state of emergency before this verdict was announced. And they also brought in, I think, like 500 National Guard troops and had them on hand, things like that. So they did keep it somewhat contained. But late on Wednesday night, you did have people shooting at cops, seemingly people who were mingling with the crowd of protesters. Like it wasn't just like something that might happen on an average night in Louisville anyway, in a bad neighborhood. It seemed like it was like associated with the protesters, and they didn't just shoot at the cops; they shot the cops. Two cops were shot. Fortunately for them, I guess it did not. They did not have really bad injuries. Both of them survived. One of them, I think, had to go through surgery, but they're both, they're fine. But yeah, two cops were shot. It did get pretty wild in that sense in terms of violence. But in terms of like rioting and arson fires and stuff like that, it did stay somewhat contained. But again, we did have shootings.
Well, in a way, Will, I've been worried about this, but it's something that I've kind of been afraid is coming. Not only because of just kind of the situation in the U.S. with how many cops are getting away with murdering people, specifically people of color. Although Duncan Lemp, a young white man killed in, I think, Maryland, right? Not that long ago, was a very similar situation to Breonna Taylor, and they haven't even like done a tenth of what they've done to the killers of Breonna Taylor, to the killers of Duncan Lepp. I mean, at least the cops of Breonna Taylor are thoroughly disgraced in the town, and I think again, one I think all have been fired, and one again is facing some charges. Where in Duncan Lepp, I don't even know if they've investigated it at all. So like these are deeper problems, but the fact that it goes on, and then especially just the way that the media has been really playing up on it. And look, I'll stories all day about different interactions police have with cops, or police have with regular people. And a white cop shoots a black man, and that's the headline of the story. But then you see like a black cop beat on a white lady, and they'll say like cop beats a woman or something like that, but they don't then specify the color of the skin. And so it seems like they're really trying to build a narrative around that. And I feel like we've seen this a little bit before, where there was the police shot in Dallas. And then what was that guy's name? Sam Dorner, I think. Out in California, who killed some police officers. It was in LA. I forget exactly how it all went down, but this guy was a cop, and he tried to report some things that his fellow police were doing, and he ends up killing a couple cops and stuff like that. And so my guess is that if you kind of pour this much fuel on the fire, eventually some people are going to bubble over and start to do things like this. And I think the solution, if you want to prevent it, is just holding the other cops accountable. Not that you obviously one of these people has been apprehended, and anybody who's just randomly shooting people is a disturbing character, but I don't know. And then seeing a lot of the other things I've seen in just on the streets of Louisville in response, I saw one kid come up behind a cop who was fortunately wearing a bike helmet, but swing a metal bat at the back of his head.
That thing connected too, man. You could hear it like tink, like hit his head.
Had that hit his head, I'm guessing that cop would be dead, or at the very least have significant brain damage and be fighting for his life at this point. And then I saw another one where a protester was laying in the street, and a cop on a bicycle ran over that protester's neck, which maybe that person is fine. I certainly don't see that as close as attempted murder or hitting somebody in the back of the head with a metal bat. But at the same
Yeah,
time,
that,
that's some pretty severe, assault charges that cops should be facing.
Yeah, with the bike one, I thought people were maybe overreacting a little bit to that because if you look close, the cop isn't actually riding the bike. He's actually just walking along with it, and like it is like you should not do that to somebody where you like he like ramped it over the guy's head. But like I don't know, some people were saying like, oh my God, that cop should be charged for like attempted murder or something. But like he wasn't his weight was not on the bike and stuff.
Oh,
But still,
okay.
it's terrible optics though to see him just like you could tell the cop totally did it on purpose. He's like, all right, this guy's laying in the road. I'm just gonna keep going and like ramp right over his head.
Will, there is a little bit of a higher expectation on the people whose job it is to maintain order, not to act like thuds in the street,
Right,
versus
right.
the people who, are potentially, looters and people taking shots at police.
Right.
So, any more on this, Will?
No, I think we hit all like most of the important points. There was more. There's been more unrest in Louisville tonight. There was more, but I don't think it even got to the level of last night. So it's not. It wasn't much to comment on there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, two cops were shot, and that's notable, but it's not like the city was burned down or anything like that. So, actually, from the amount of I think rioting that people thought was going to happen, it probably came in way under expectations.
Yeah, yeah,
Again, though, there were the two cops shot that was significant. But
yeah,
let's talk about some looting now, Will.
yeah. No kidding.
Right, so we're not talking about some guy robbing a Target or something like that, but rather this article from Reason by Elizabeth Nolan Brown. Pentagon uses pandemic response cash to pay defense contractors for more war toys, and what she reports is on this Washington Post write up, which is they got I think $1 billion in total for the Pentagon that was passed as part of the CARES Act, and it was supposed to go to prevent and prepare for the coronavirus, as well as produce the PPEs, the personal protective equipment and stuff like that. Instead, they just gave it as bailouts to companies like Rolls Royce, and I think this was actually like the mid tier defense contractors that were bailed out,
Yeah.
because the big boys got their bailouts just in the regular CARES Act through different packages, like Boeing got theirs and stuff like that. So, Will, what do you think about this? I mean, they stole so much of our money here. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, man. I mean, like just like thinking in terms of like the total like 3 or 4 trillion that they've spent in relation to the coronavirus and these various bills. I guess this billion is kind of a drop in that insane ocean. But still, $1 billion is still a gigantic pile of money. And like, did the Pentagon use this for their, COVID response and build up all this life-saving medical gear and like they were supposed to? Like, no, of course not. They end up handing a lot of this, most of it, I think, to arms dealers who spent the stuff on stuff completely unrelated to the virus. I think the breakdown, I think they gave like 200 million to, like you mentioned, Rolls Royce and a couple other companies to maintain the shipbuilding industry. They gave 80 million to this firm in Kansas that makes aircraft parts. They gave a couple tens of millions for companies making drones and like space surveillance technology, and another 2 million for the firm that makes the fabric for the U.S. Army dress uniforms. So a lot of the stuff having absolutely nothing to do with the pandemic at all. This is just handing these companies money. And the thing is, too, some of these companies actually double dipped, where they went into the paycheck protection program and they got like cheap or forgivable loans in addition to all this bailout cash. So like they really had a windfall. Those companies who did the double dipping. And the DoD, of course, their argument in all this is that like, oh, we have to support the arms industry and other military related industries like the one that makes the fabric for the uniforms because it's all so important to our national security. But like, first of all, that is not where the money was supposed to go. Like the Pentagon had pledged that they would spend, I think, 3/4 of that money on medical supplies and stuff. But then ultimately they just decided how, they were going to spend it however they wanted to, I guess. Which even at this point, Congress has like grumbled about, kind of surprisingly. They haven't done anything about it, but they have like some, I think, Democrats in the House have like questioned some DoD officials about this. But then the other thing about this too is that like the Pentagon's rationale for all this, for why they had to do it, because I don't think they're really hiding this. I think they're admitting that like, yeah, this is how we spent the money. But they, I think, way overstate the importance of the arms sector and just how how important that is, how we have to support it. We don't really need a lot of this crap that they make. But then even if we assume that they are that important and we really do need to be handing them money, the military still ends up giving them way, way too much money to a lot of these companies. There's so much corruption and graft and stuff that goes into arms procurement and procure really anything the government does where they're spending tax dollars in the private sector. Like I think we're all familiar with where they're spending. The Pentagon spent like $500 for a screwdriver or $1,000 for a coffee maker or whatever. And it's just the incentives. They're totally perverse incentives where they have no interest to actually economize or save money or anything. Their interest is more to like hook up the companies as much as they can and build up these real sweetheart relationships with them. Um, so I just think like the argument that we have to be giving this much money to these companies and to these arms dealers, that is vastly overstated. That we overpay for so many things. Like I'm saying, the most obvious examples are the $500 screwdrivers and stuff that the Pentagon shells out for. But that applies to everything, for aircraft parts and tanks. Like if there were to be a like market alternative to those things, it would be vastly cheaper than what these arms dealers are charging the government, just because of the incentives, just how that all works. Um, so I just think that that's all really on display here with this throwing around this money. And another thing I think this shows too, what this highlights is just how much like corruption and how little oversight there is with this money, with this spending. Like lawmakers and officials could not possibly track where these trillions and trillions of dollars are going. So like I mean, I'm kind of skeptical of the stimulus payments in general. Like, I don't really think we should be throwing around that much money, of other people's money. But if they're going to do that, I at least prefer it goes to somebody who might need it or something, not just some arms dealer who's just going to cash in on a bailout. But like, I think that is what happened here, and it's probably what's happened with countless billions of the stimulus spending that they've done with all this COVID relief.
Right. Yeah. There's countless personal trainers, waiters, small business owners in the U.S. who actually provide services that the rest of us want and use, not just random parts for expensive weapon system that won't actually defend anybody and mainly just be used as a part of an occupation force somewhere. But giving money to those people at least is a little bit beneficial to the rest of us. I understand that on the net we lose from the massive spending and everything, but at the same time, again, I'm far more interested in having like my local favorite restaurants stay open than whatever silly company apparently needs both a PPE loan and a bailout from the Pentagon in order to keep producing whatever little part they make for the F-35 or whatever ship the U.S. has. So
shoelaces or whatever they're making. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much corruption, and I guess the part that gets me is just how little other people you care about it. I mean, talk to all these people, especially like Biden supporters, and they'll talk about how much people need money, and you're like, you had $1 billion here that you could have like done something with, anything with, to help people, and instead you're just fine with them throwing it all away like they do so often. And again, Boeing's made so much money off of this coronavirus, and it's a failed company. It's a company that has planes that run into the ground based off of poor design. That's what happened with the 737 Maxes. They built a shitty plane and it crashed. Oops.
Right.
And now they get massive loans and bailouts after their company's in the toilet. No, let Boeing go under.
Yeah.
That should definitely happen. And in fact, you could then now maybe just use it as an entrapment scheme or something like that and claim the whole board members are frauds and everything for taking all this money and still giving us crap planes and everything like that. I don't know. Maybe that's the only way you could justify this, but it's just so disappointing that we give away so much of our money at a time where it could be really valuable to people too. It is, the thing. Just it should be particularly insulting to Americans that they would steal from us at a time like this. And still, I'm sure there's far more Americans who are outraged at the looting than this. I'm sure even Joe Biden's more outraged at the looting than this, and that's really saying something.
Right.
Well,
It's just business as usual.
yep. All right. Well, we have a word from our sponsor here, and that is Paloma Verde, who makes excellent CBD products. And I know Carlos sent both me and you some great products, and I talked about how I've been enjoying them on last show. So, Will, just curious how you're enjoying your CBD.
Yeah. So I've tried various CBD products over the years. Usually things I'd buy at like a head shop or a gas station or something. and never really did that much for me. But like this stuff from our new sponsor, Paloma Verde, it's a vastly higher quality, and that really does like make the difference when you're taking CBD, compared, as you might imagine, compared to something you might be buying at the gas station or something. But in my own case, I have pretty bad issues with insomnia and falling asleep. I have trouble winding down at night, and they've got these great melatonin soft gels that have CBD and melatonin in them that have been helping a lot with that lately. And it's not just for nighttime. You can, take CBD throughout the day as well. At Paloma Verde, they have all kinds of things for different circumstances. They got fruit gummies you can eat. They have liquid extracts. They have salves and creams that you can massage into like, sore joints and stuff, and for inflammation. And they have all kinds of these soft gels. Like I said, with the one with the melatonin, they have one with curcumin. They have a everyday formula. They have a lot of different options for a lot of different circumstances. And you can find all that stuff at Paloma Verde Store. That's PALOMAVERDE store.com. And if you want to get 25% off your order, if you spend more than $75, use promo code PEACE, PEACE, like the thing that we want to see.
That's right. And there are links on the show notes page at the Libertarian Institute and on the YouTube channel. All right, well, now on to the really bad news of today's show, like we haven't gotten to it yet, and that is the situation in Yemen. I came across this story at Reuters a couple days ago titled, "We Do Our Best. Fuel Shortages in Yemen Make Doctors' Lives Even Harder." And what's going on here, Will, is that there's people right now, especially in northern Yemen, in hospitals, and everywhere in the world, people have kidney failure, and so this lady's on dialysis, right? And the company or the hospital's power completely goes out while you're on the middle of dialysis. So now the nurse or whatever has to stand there and turn the dialysis machine by hand to make sure this lady's blood doesn't clot. While the hospital tries to restore power. So I know, Will, you've done some coverage and you've talked to reporters like Nasser Arabi and other people on the ground in Yemen about the humanitarian catastrophe over this last 5.5 years. But this is the what was being warned about 3, 4, 5 years ago, Will, was that the situation in Yemen is going to get this bad. And it's now this bad. So yeah, I don't know, what details do you have on just the humanitarian catastrophe there?
Yeah, that Reuters story was pretty harrowing about like the dialysis and turning the machine by hand. The nurses doing that's incredible. There have been like fuel and water shortages in Yemen for quite a while now, as you might expect in a war-torn country with a really bad humanitarian crisis. But since the summer, like over the last few months, the fuel imports into Yemen have dropped off like almost completely, and it's creating this massive shortage. Where I think prices have actually like tripled over the summer from their previous level, which was already like staggeringly high during the war. Like the prices were already extremely high. They've tripled since then. This is largely, I believe, because of the Saudi blockade. The Saudis and their coalition, who've been waging war on Yemen since 2015, they control a lot of the airspace and ocean around Yemen. The Houthis don't really have much of an air force to speak of or much of a navy. So the coalition ends up controlling a lot of the commercial ports as well, and they can block goods from coming into the country. And another thing that's not really helping this is earlier this month, too, the Houthis have also halted UN humanitarian flights from coming into Sana'a, the capital, apparently in protest of the Saudi coalition's blockade and blocking these fuel shipments. But I mean, obviously, that has not helped things when they're, halting these additional humanitarian flights. The coalition, though, as well as the government in exile under Mansour Hadi that it props up, the Saudi coalition has been trying to reinstall this guy into power in Yemen. But they claim their whole argument in all this is that they only block ships from coming in so they can make sure they don't bring in weapons. And they say that they've accused the Houthis of like grabbing fuel to sell it on the black market, and that they've just created this whole crisis themselves. I don't doubt that those black market sales are happening. That happens a lot with humanitarian aid in Yemen. Some of it gets skimmed off the top and sold. But that is clearly not all that's happening here. And I'm not the only one who thinks so, too. Even the UN Special Envoy, Martin Griffiths, is saying that, like, no, these shortages have to do with the blockade. And he's calling on the Saudis to lift, or at least partially lift, the blockade to let in some fuel. But I mean, regardless of what's driving it, the effect is all the same. I mean, like obviously you need fuel to transport things from A to B, whether that's a person to a hospital or a good to a store shelf or something. But you also need fuel for water pumps and generators, and like we were saying, dialysis machines and life support machines, all kinds of basic amenities of like modern civilized life. which are, as if the situation wasn't already worse in Yemen. We have the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Now some of those basic amenities are becoming even more difficult to get, just making their plight even worse. I think we did a decent job at summarizing some of like the humanitarian stuff going on in Yemen on episode 8. If people want to go back and look at that one, I think we also just have a clip too, just focusing on the Yemen part, so people can go to the YouTube channel and look for that. But something like 80% of the whole population of Yemen is dependent on some form of humanitarian aid. So we're talking tens of millions of people who are in like dire situation here, and that's not certainly not new. They've been in that situation for years. Like hundreds of thousands of people have probably died between the fighting and the deprivation and everything caused by the war. We don't really have like super reliable figures for casualties. As we've mentioned before, they rely on health facilities, and over half of those have been put out of commission in Yemen through the bombing and fighting. It's a complete disaster, the whole thing. And the Saudis have done this with American support for 5 years straight, spanning 2 U.S. administrations, both a Democratic one and a Republican one. So America's name is really all over this situation in Yemen and all over this fuel shortage, too.
Right, and I can't mention this enough, as we covered recently. Both now Obama and Trump administration officials have sought legal counsel over the war crimes that the U.S. has committed in Yemen. They're afraid of the repercussions coming because we've essentially committed or working on committing a genocide in that country, just a mass starvation campaign against the people, and it's completely illegal to do and immoral. And if we were a better society, we would probably set all these people afloat and just make sure they can't come back into our country, because just the absolute worst kind of people. Now, this is what Reuters was reporting the situation in Yemen to be on Tuesday, I believe. And we got some articles here from Dave DeCamp they publish at antiwar.com from Tuesday and Wednesday. The first is that a Saudi airstrike hit a plastics factory. And so there's not a whole lot of production or anything going on in North Yemen that would be generating economic opportunities for people. But there are some opportunities, and one was the plastics factory, and the Saudis decided to blow that up. So that's pretty disturbing. As another, not maybe not as bad as the target. They bombed hospitals. They bombed a school bus full of children at one point. So obviously, you can't expect a lot of moral outrage from a group that blew up a school bus to not blow up like a factory or something like that. But that's the first thing that happens. But then the worst news is that the UN cuts healthcare aid in Yemen. And Dave writes that the UN said on Wednesday that it has cut vital aid to 300 healthcare facilities across Yemen, and cuts have also been made to the UN's food distribution services. And then it says that the cuts are coming because the UN hasn't raised enough money. They're trying to raise $3.2 billion for programs in Yemen this year. They've only raised $1 billion. However, a lot of that billion has been pledged by countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the exact countries waging this war on Yemen. However, they're only pledging the money. They're not actually coming through with donations. And so, I mean, it's like, it's bad, and then it's even worse. And the last one I have here is that heavy clashes have now erupted near Yemen's Hodeidah. Hodeidah is a city that lies on the Red Sea and is home to the key port in Yemen. I think it's the only port in Yemen that could support, deep bottom boats and stuff like that. Even the port in Aden, which is the main port in the south, can't support as large as cargo ships as the port in Hodeidah can. So it's very important that this port is able to, have these massive ships come in with the food, medicine, and fuel needed for 28 million people. The 28 million people, a huge number of people that live in Yemen. And if fighting is going on around the city, as we talked about on countless episodes of Foreign Policy Focus, it really slows down the aid that could, first of all, just get to Yemen, but once it gets in Yemen, actually leave the city of Hodeidah and get to the people, the rest of the country. Hodeidah, I think, is like the 4th or the 5th largest city. The vast majority of the population lives in other areas of the country, mostly the areas controlled by the Houthis, which struggle to get the most food because they're in opposition to the Saudis and the Emiratis, who control Yemen's airspace and water and impose this just strict sanctions regime. So, uh, well, I guess the only thing I could say here as I kick it back to you is at least I don't have any more bad news today on Yemen, but it sounds like it's as bad as it could possibly get there at this point with the UN. First, you have these hospitals that had to shut down because they don't have fuel, and now the UN's cutting aid to 300 more healthcare facilities. It sounds like hell.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the ones that the hospitals that are even left standing, like, that even have a structure left, from not being bombed, those are the ones that are now being deprived of these dollars, unfortunately. Yeah. I mean, like, it really is unfortunate. I've seen also, like, yeah, this a series of reports recently on how, like, fighting is flaring up again. The clashes are starting up. There was the report of the plastic factory was destroyed. I also saw this week there was a report saying the Saudis had bombed nearly 1,000 farms in the last couple of years. So, I mean, obviously hitting civilian targets is not uncommon for them at all, for the coalition. They've bombed homes and funeral processions and, like you said, a school bus and, like, ancient cultural sites, UNESCO heritage sites, all kinds of every type of, civilian structure you could hit. They've bombed it, and they've done it consistently and repeatedly over 5 years. And now the Houthis do sometimes hit back. They do launch these, like, crude missiles over the border into Saudi sometimes, which they have also been doing recently. They've been launching those attacks. The Saudis usually say they intercept those, but sometimes they do damage. Like, they've hit a couple oil facilities before and other important economic infrastructure, which, like, to be fair, that is civilian targets. Like, the Houthis are when they're bombing, like, an oil facility or something. That's not a military target. However, the strikes have killed far less people compared to the coalition. They're not flying, like, air raids and sorties and stuff. They're shooting these, like, fairly crude missiles. I mean, they have had some slightly more sophisticated attacks. There was one, like, really wide scale one with drones that seemed pretty, like, fancy. But again, these things are not inflicting any kind of, like, nowhere near the types of civilian casualties that the Saudis and the coalition have. Again, all with American support and British support, and with the UN basically looking the other way. And I don't know how this ends. Like, this has seemed to me like it seemed absolutely intolerable since, like, the first year of the war, and we're making our way through the 6th year now. Like, it's still grinding on. And I really have not seen anything recently or in the last 6 months or so that would convince me that this is going to end anytime soon. Very occasionally, the Houthis and the Saudis will make some overtures to talks and negotiations and stuff, but it just doesn't, like, that's happened. Those have come and gone, and nothing has happened. It's not ended the war. There's been no ceasefire or anything like that. So honestly, I don't know how this ends. I don't know what the resolution is to this conflict.
Right. Well, that's one of the things that I think stands out most is that it's not even like there's a realistic solution that anybody seems to really be suggesting. The powers that be, Saudi Arabia in particular, has absolutely the most leverage on what happens in this situation, other than maybe the United States, but actively. Saudi Arabia is the biggest player and, gets to kind of dictate what's going on. And so long as they maintain that Mansour Hadi has to return to power in Yemen, that's not a viable solution. So it means that there's no real way for this war to end, until I guess at least they're willing to look at putting somebody else in charge in Yemen.
Maybe they should do an election or something. Like, try that out.
Right.
With more than one person on the ballot, unlike when Hadi was elected with the support of Hillary Clinton, hailing democracy in Yemen, one man on the ballot.
Well, we should name the show like Blame Hillary Clinton or something. And just every single thing we talk about, go back and explain how this was all Hillary Clinton's fault. But to explain how this was all Hillary Clinton's fault, in 2012, when the Arab Spring came to Yemen, the longtime dictator was actually deposed, injured pretty significantly in a attempt against his life, and yeah, and Hillary Clinton came in and took his vice president and put him on the ballot against absolutely no one and helped him win a one-man election, declare democracy in Yemen, and then just kind of let the things happen in Yemen that happened. And of course, the man who was elected on a one-man ballot turned out to be pretty much the same dictator as they had before, except he wasn't as tactful at it and, made a lot of people mad, including the Houthis. And he kept picking fights until he lost his throne. I mean, he was just being too aggressive, too big for his britches, and it came back to bite him. And rather than just accepting the fact that our sock puppet got chased out of Yemen, we just demand that he be returned to the throne. And it's absolutely absurd and stupid that that would be something that happens, especially after all this time of essentially him greenlighting this tragedy that's unfolding in Yemen. You would have to imagine that had he said that I don't want the Saudis to do this and was making a big stink publicly, well, I guess Mohammed bin Salman probably would have tried to kill him, if not actually just kill him. But assuming that he lived, that's a pretty meaningful thing to say, is that this war is being waged essentially on your behalf, at least publicly on your behalf, and you say I don't want to do it anymore. That's very meaningful, and that's not going to happen because I think he still thinks he's going to come back to power somehow.
Yeah, that's right. He wants to be back on the throne, no matter how no matter how big the mountain of corpses, no matter how large the river of blood that it requires to do that. So, yep.
Another real tragedy we have going on here, Will, is the case of Julian Assange. And I think maybe the biggest tragedy of all of it is just how little coverage it's getting. People are going to talk about 2020 and, oh my God, the coronavirus and this thing happened, the wildfires and this and that. And I guess the amazing thing to me about 2020 is we could potentially watch the First Amendment vanish while nobody even recognizes, pays attention, or seems to care. And so, I have stories here from Craig Murray at his blog. He's titling his article, Your Man in the Public Gallery, and then Assange hearing day, and then whatever day it is. So this was, I believe, Wednesday's write-up. And then I have also Kevin Gunstola's write-up from the same day. Doctor diagnosed Julian Assange with Asperger's syndrome. And so I thought that was probably the most interesting thing that happened in Assange's hearings this week, other than maybe the judge making a real push to get this thing over with as soon as possible. But Will, what were your key takeaways from this week?
Yeah. I guess we can go over just a few highlights from what the Assange stuff this week. The first thing I'll mention actually is this letter that like 180 world leaders and diplomats and legal associations and stuff that they all signed demanding Assange's freedom. I thought that was noteworthy. It's a pretty long and substantial document. Some of their main arguments are that like Assange will not face a fair trial in the United States, that he would face like cruel and unusual punishments here, that in solitary confinement and that kind of stuff. And that it's a dire threat to not only press freedom in this country, in the U.S., but all over the planet. So obviously Assange is not an American citizen, he's an Australian, and all these legal proceedings are happening in the UK, so this is a very international threat, I think. And this letter, they addressed it to Prime Minister Boris Johnson of the UK, trying to ask him to intervene to do something to stop this. I'm not sure at this point if he even could. I guess as the Prime Minister, he probably has quite a bit of leeway. But it was signed by quite a few high profile people. Most of in terms of the heads of state and stuff, it was mostly Latin American leaders. We had the president of Argentina, Alberto Fernandez. We had two former presidents of Brazil. We had Nicolas Maduro, the socialist president of Venezuela. And we also had actually the former leader of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, who actually, I think under his administration, he actually approved Assange's asylum in the embassy in London, only for the traitor Lenin Moreno to come back and to rescind, unfortunately. But I thought that was interesting. That whole letter, I just think if people want to go through that, they actually cite throughout the whole thing. They have footnotes citing UN resolutions and stuff. So they're showing everything we're saying here is backed by international law. So I thought that was a.
I'll just say I believe the two American signatories were former Senator Mike Gravel and former Congressman Ron Paul.
Yeah.
So.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I don't have anything else on the letter. That's all I had to add.
Okay, that's cool.
Well,
I got some more to go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, in terms of the actual hearings themselves, I think there was some interesting stuff this week too. One of the major themes this week in the testimony, they've had psychiatrists and doctors and stuff testifying, but one of the major themes has been whether Assange is a suicide risk. If he is what is the risk that he'll take his own life if he is indeed sent off to the U.S. to be prosecuted? And you had quite a bit of interesting testimony. You had the psychiatrist who's interviewed Assange 20 separate times, Michael Koppelman, who testified for the defense. And he says that Assange is suffering from severe depression and even psychotic symptoms, where apparently he's written suicide letters to friends and family in jail, preparing for his demise and stuff. And I think he's drawn up a will. But he's also been having auditory hallucinations, apparently, in solitary there in Belmarsh. So like, if that's any sign to his psychological state, like that's not good at all. I mean, auditory hallucinations, that is like a sign of psychosis, like a severe mental issue there. Um, then that was on Tuesday. Then the next day, on Wednesday, you had another psychiatrist testifying to the same effect. But as you mentioned, he focused more on the fact that Assange may have some form of autism. I think like you said, Asperger's, that like might factor into this suicide risk. That might actually increase it. Someone with that kind of disorder. Um, Now, of course, the prosecutor, Lewis, he tried to sort of question this. He tried to say Assange was maybe like feigning these symptoms, making it up to try to gain sympathy or something. But Koppelman actually like kind of smacked that down in the previous testimony, saying that like, no, I'm a professional. I've dealt with people who are exaggerating or faking symptoms, and that's not what's happening here. And so he definitely, I think, shot down that argument. They did also, the defense team also got a prosecution witness to admit that he was not familiar with what prison Assange might be sent to if he were to be extradited. And so that I thought was like a nice a nice blow to the prosecution side, because this guy, I think part of the whole reason he was called to testify was to comment on like the conditions that Assange might face. And the prosecution called him to say that like, nah, that'll be fine. He's not under that much of a risk. But the defense got him to admit that like, maybe I don't actually know that much about the conditions he'll face. So I thought that was a pretty good dunk on the prosecution.
Right. Yeah, I guess to add a little bit to the Asperger's or whatever stuff. So I think from my understanding of working in mental health here in the US is that the UK on mental health, like as far as like perception goes, like public perception goes, and just like I think clinically is a little bit behind the US as far as providing like care, and just like I said, stigma, like the idea of like having mental illness, if it's like something you should be ashamed of or not.
Yep.
So I think that would like that certainly came out some in the cross examination, especially from the prosecutor, who was like asserting that there's no way Julian Assange could be a functioning adult and have Asperger's, or what in the U.S. is now called autism spectrum disorder. He asserted that Assange couldn't understand like what love is, or have a relationship, have meaningful friendships and stuff like. And all of these are things that like I'm pretty sure if this happened in the U.S., it would have been considered offensive by most like progressive-ish people. Like it was
Canceled
pretty
for it.
bad at times, where how kind of backwards his things were. A couple things that of the testimony that stood out, people talking about Assange, that made me think that maybe this is an accurate diagnosis, as they talked about him like not understanding social cues, like in an early relationship when he was going out to like bars, he would like walk behind the bar and like turn down the music if it was too loud, or change it if he didn't like it. And so that's certainly something that having a history of working with people like who are on the autism spectrum wouldn't surprise me happening. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah,
that's the story I
sounds
hear.
like my
I'd be like,
cousin.
oh yeah. And then just like how interpersonal relationships are difficult for him to manage, especially like in-person relationships and stuff like that. Although I did think the lawyer's testimony, when John Lewis was asking him about John Lewis is the prosecutor, about how could he possibly like hold a press conference, or be at an event and like talk to hundreds of people with having this diagnosis. And the guy was like, that's not a problem. But the prosecutor seems to think that like you know autism means essentially like severe Down syndrome, and like if you're not drooling on yourself, then you don't have this. Kevin Gostola did a great interview on the Scott Horton show and point out the reason that this is so important is, I guess, the UK has denied two extraditions to the US, and both were computer hackers, and both extraditions were denied, in part at least because the people who were said to be extradited had some kind of developmental disability like autism, and it was determined that they essentially wouldn't receive the care they needed in a U.S. prison, which is absolutely true. Um,
Yeah.
when I was working at mental health, I had people like end up, going to prison for various things. And while you're in prison, if like let's say you're on psychiatric meds, they don't let you take your normal meds. You have to take whatever like prisons prescribed generic is. And I guess I mean generic in the sense like it's not the name brand that you're used to, but also like it kind of doesn't work as well because anything that works well also usually has some kind of other recreational benefits or something like that, or people will look to sell it, stuff like that.
Right,
And so,
benzos, stuff like that.
yep. So any kind of sleeping medication that maybe you need to sleep, anti-anxiety medication, you can't have it in prison. Some of the antipsychotics as well, anti-depression meds, all that kind of stuff. They give you really, really light stuff, and it has to be hell for anybody. Not to mention that, a lot of people, especially if Assange is exhibiting any psychiatric or psychotic symptoms, like those kind of medications that people prescribe for that, work very, very particularly on the brain. And
Right.
so, one medication may work really well, but if you prescribe somebody the generic version of that same medication, it may not work at all. And these are the kinds of things that are stripped from people when they enter American prisons is their effective medications. In fact, I was once in a courtroom while some older gentleman was, I guess, on his like fifth DUI, but hadn't had any in 30 years. This guy was like 80 and had heart conditions, and the judge was saying they had to spend a mandatory 14-day in prisons. And then there was like an issue around his heart medication, like that, what medication he wouldn't be able to have in jail. And the judge was like, well, there's nothing I could do. You got to go to jail for 14 days. And the guy was like, but I can't take my heart medication in jail. Like, I'm going to die. And the judge was like, well, the best I could do is give it another month, and you could work something out with your doctor. I'm not sure what his doctor's gonna do to make a magical medicine in that
Cut a
amount
deal
of
with them or
time,
yeah, what?
right? But yeah, but these are the kind of things that people face in U.S. prisons, and it's absolutely insane. And maybe that's the kind of thing that would get Assange off. Now, Kevin pointed out that these things happened at like the highest level of the UK court and not at the level that we're currently at, and that there's appeals and stuff to come. So I don't know. I just thought all that was very interesting. I want to give a little bit of what my thoughts were on that. Anything else
Yeah.
on Assange this week, Will?
Yeah, there's one last thing that I wanted to mention. I think it was Wednesday, the hearing on Wednesday. They requested the defense side had requested from the judge Baritzer that like after the testimony is done, could we have a month delay to like prepare for the latest superseding indictment? And the defense had already previously asked for some kind of delay, already they were turned down. And unfortunately, I think the judge has now turned that down too. And she says that like they will have to prepare and submit their final arguments but on the week of October 5th. So it really does not give them a whole lot of time after the testimony is finished for them to wrap that up and to get that finished. So that is unfortunate. They said that it would cause, quote, massive problems for the defense. And she said, too bad.
Yeah, well, yeah, that was the last thing I was going to add is just how much the judge is trying to rush the end of this thing. Apparently, there's a lot of witnesses still to be called, and that some of them may no longer be called, including Noam Chomsky and Patrick Coburn. Potentially not being called. Other witnesses are going to just have their statements read or kind of, quickly brushed aside. I think that's what happened to Cassandra Fairbanks. And it just seems like, her goal at this point is to rush through it. The thing that I found most notable about what you pointed out, Will, is what was, rushing the closing arguments. One that I think points the defense was trying to make is that, we've heard all this testimony. So the hearings are the witnesses are going to be heard through next Friday, and then starting the next week, they want to do closing arguments. And they essentially said, we need more time to prepare because of the superseding indictment and because of all the things that the witnesses have said. Well, it's now become clear that the judge doesn't care what the witnesses have said because they don't get extra time to prepare from there. But the thing is that this seems like kind of the prosecution slash courts effort to railroad Assange this whole time was kind of set behind this whole, we're just gonna make this happen as soon as everything as quickly as possible, and for people to have information, at as slow as pace as possible at the latest possible date. There's a lot of witnesses who have reported getting like multi-hundred-page packets from the prosecution within like a day or the day of their scheduled to go on the stand and testify and stuff like that. That's crazy. Like, and then the prosecution will ask him about, oh, did you read this and this and this? And we'd be like, no, if you send me more than 100 pages in the day, I'm not going to read it all in principle. because I can't get through all this. I'm not gonna look through it. You gotta give me enough time to look at the information if you want me to testify to it. And then at times the prosecution tries to criticize them for not having processed all the information and stuff like that. It's really the reading up the reports from Craig Murray and Kevin Gustola every day have been absolutely shocking. Joe Loria is also doing a great job covering this. Oh, I know. The last thing I want to add is I caught this on Joanne Leone's Around the Empire podcast when she was interviewing Kevin, and he said that it was getting, I think, to be like a few weeks before the trial was supposed to start, and he actually is the one who requested from the court to have remote access because of COVID. And I guess he hired a lawyer to facilitate his request to the court and everything. And it's crazy to me that, first of all, the guy that runs Shadowproof, this is a major U.S. news site, is the one that has to do this, and how important it is to support different kinds of independent media, because if Kevin didn't have people support, he couldn't have hired that lawyer, and then who knows if there would be like this public access as good as they have it, which isn't that great as is. But that there is some access for people to apply to get a remote feed of the Assange hearing. That way somebody could bring us the story of what's going on in the courtroom.
Yeah, we'd be just guessing and speculating at this point. We wouldn't even have any updates to give because there'd be nothing coming out of there.
Right. Yeah, it'd just be Craig Murray's, I guess, who's actually gotten into the courtroom a few times. Or I think even he doesn't get in the actual courtroom. I think he's in like an adjacent
screening
room. Yeah, and he's in there,
exactly.
But at least he's there and kind of a part of it. But yeah, it's just so disappointing there's so little coverage. But
good on Kevin, though. Good on Kevin Gustola for doing that, man. That's real yeoman's work.
We should wrap it here, and just remind everybody to check out Will on Twitter at the Will Porter. Will writes up the news at RT, and so you can't actually find his name on the articles he writes, but he tweets them all out or puts them on Facebook every day. So follow him in any of those places, you'll find that. I'm at Kyle Anzalone _ on Twitter. I am the news editor at the Libertarian Institute, so I write the daily news roundup and then, of course, co-host of the show. I follow the show at con _ interest on Twitter, conflicts of interest on Facebook. The YouTube channel is Conflicts of Interest, and then patreon.com/conflicts of interest. And don't forget to support our sponsor, Paloma Verde store.com. Use code PEACE. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Kyle. See you, everybody.